Baby, if you thought the West Coast was ever going to be one big, peaceful family reunion, wrap that thought up and put it away right now. Because the loudest voice in Compton just fired the shot that everybody was praying would never come. And here is the craziest part. He did it without once saying Kendrick Lamar's name out loud on the record. That is not an accident. That is a message, and it was aimed directly at Compton, straight at PG Lang, straight through the heart of everything Kendrick Lamar just spent 2 years building. Look, I'm going to come right out and say it, because I know why you clicked. The West Coast Civil War is officially here. Not a rumor. Not a drill. Not one of those little subs that people squint at and argue about in the comments for 3 straight days before everybody forgets. No. The Game got in the booth, brought Drake with him, put out a song, slapped a broken-down car with no wheels on the front of it, and then dared every single person watching to read between the lines. And baby, the lines were not hard to read at all. They were basically printed in neon. The Game knew exactly what he was doing the second he stepped into that studio. The Game is not the rookie who slips up and says the wrong thing by accident. He never has been. He is one of the most deliberate, calculating storytellers the West Coast has ever produced. A man who survived G-Unit, survived 1,000 label fights, survived every beef the industry threw at him, and came out the other side still standing. So when the Game moves, you better believe every single detail is intentional. The song title, the 2-word Drake feature, the artwork, the timing, the surprise album dropping the very same night. All of it was engineered for maximum chaos. And chaos, as we are all about to find out, is exactly what he got. So let me set the table for you, because there are layers to this story, and if you only catch one of them, you are going to miss the entire movie. This thing did not start last week. This is not a brand new beef. This is an old, festering wound that somebody just ripped open on purpose, in front of the entire world, with a smile on his face. If y'all remember, and I know some of you do, because you were in the trenches when it all went down, Drake and Kendrick Lamar gave us one of the biggest, bloodiest battles modern music has ever witnessed back in 2024. That was not a little back and forth. That was a war. It shut down timelines. It broke every streaming record that existed. When those two locked horns, it stopped being about bars and became about history in real time. Every record they traded was an event that shut the entire timeline down. People were canceling plans to argue in group chats. Radio shows had to throw out their rundowns because the news was moving too fast and nobody could keep up. And through all of it, hip-hop sat back and watched the two most important artists of a generation try to erase each other in public. It was beautiful and brutal at the same time, the kind of spectacle the culture had not seen in years, and by the time the smoke cleared, there was no middle left to stand in. You were on one side or the other, and the side you picked said something about you that no amount of "I'm neutral" could ever take back. And when the dust finally settled, it was Kendrick Lamar standing on top of the mountain, with his chest puffed out, while Drake sat back and watched the entire industry line up to decide whose side it was on. Kendrick Lamar gave us Not Like Us, the kind of record that becomes an anthem overnight, the kind of song they were literally screaming in the clubs, at the cookouts, at the stadiums. Kendrick Lamar crowned himself the certified boogeyman, and then he rode that boogeyman energy all the way to history, all the way to that GNX, all the way to a Grammy that felt like the final word in an argument that had been going for years. And Drake? Drake went quiet. Not gone, never gone, but quiet by Drake's standards. He stepped back. He let the dust settle. And that silence, that retreat, that long stretch of the biggest artist on the planet not being the loudest person in the room anymore, that is where the Game comes in. Drake tucked himself away to work on the next chapter, that Iceman era his fans have been begging for. And in that vacuum, the entire temperature of the party changed. The Game himself said it out loud months ago, and it was one of the most revealing things a rapper has said in public in a long time. He told the world the clubs do not hit the same without Drake, that the whole art form dropped 50% the moment Drake stepped back, that you can walk into a party right now and not hear a single record that makes you feel alive the way one Drake record used to. People brushed it off as stan behavior, as a superfan speaking his truth into the void. But looking back now, that was not a fan talking. That was an ally declaring sides before the war even restarted. The Game was not just mourning the absence. He was announcing the return, his and Drake's, together, in the one place nobody expected it. Because the Game looked at that whole situation, looked at Drake sitting in the corner, minding his business, looked at Kendrick Lamar running the West, and decided, in the most the Game way possible, to open his mouth and remind everybody exactly where he stands. Now here's the backstory you actually need, the part that makes all of this make sense, because without it this just looks like another feature and another diss track. The Game and Drake have history. Real history. They linked up in 2015 on a record called 100, and the game did something back then that a lot of West Coast people have never fully forgiven him for. He brought Drake to Compton. He brought him right into the heart of the city, walked him through the neighborhood, and shot the music video there, on home turf, like it was nothing. And for a certain camp, that was not nothing. For the people around Kendrick Lamar, the optics were absolutely wild. You bring the man who is positioning himself as the adversary into the one place he's supposed to never touch, and you smile for the camera while you do it. That was the first crack in the wall between the game and Kendrick Lamar, and that crack never really closed. Let me take you back to 2015 and actually sit in that moment, because it is impossible to understand the explosion without understanding the slow burn that came first. The game and Drake linked up on a record called 100, and on its own, that record was a genuine event. Two giants from two completely different worlds coming together to make something that knocked in every club from the Pacific all the way to the Atlantic, the kind of cross-coast handshake that used to mean something before the lines got drawn. But it was never the song that fractured things. It was the video. The game brought Drake straight into Compton and shot that entire video right in the middle of the neighborhood, walking the biggest outsider in hip-hop through the very streets that birthed the West Coast movement, smiling for the camera the entire time like it was the most natural thing in the world. For the camp around Kendrick Lamar, that was a line you simply did not cross. You do not take the man who is becoming the enemy and gift him a tour of the one place he is supposed to never touch, and you especially do not turn it into a celebration. That image, Drake in the heart of Compton, welcomed, embraced, treated like family, never left the conversation. It became the thing people pointed back to every single time the game's loyalties came into question, the clip that got replayed in every argument about who was really down for the coast and who was just using the coast as a backdrop. And it planted a quiet, stubborn resentment that sat there for years, patient and unspoken, waiting for nothing but the right spark to set the whole thing off. So from the jump, this is not some random Tuesday. This is years of subtext, years of silence, years of two Compton legends circling each other without ever fully colliding, finally bubbling up to the surface because one of them decided he had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Let me talk about the song itself, because the song is where all the secrets are hiding. The record is called No Breaks. It dropped ahead of the game's new album, and it comes with Drake attached to it like a brand name slapped on a box. But here's the thing that everybody on the timeline noticed within about 10 seconds of pressing play. Drake is not on the song. Not really. Not in any way that matters. Drake, one of the most dominant artists of his generation, a man who can out-rap damn near anybody alive when he wants to, shows up on this record to say exactly two words. Two. He says, no breaks. That's it. That's the entire Drake contribution to what is being marketed as a Drake feature. Now let's stop and really sit with that for a second, because it tells you everything you need to know about this whole operation. This is not Drake hopping on a track to bless it with a verse. This is Drake's voice being used as a sample, as a prop, as a flex. The game is not out here trying to make the song of the summer with his old friend. The game is out here trying to make a statement, and the statement is, I can get Drake on my record, and you can't. And I don't even need him to rap for it to work. That's not collaboration anymore. That is a weapon. The game took the biggest star in the world, reduced him to 2 syllables, and pointed him directly at the man he used to call an ally. If Drake was fully in on it, it's a sin of epic proportions. And if Drake wasn't in on it, if that little 2-word hook was just some old vocals somebody dug out of a folder, then it's even more disrespectful, because it means the whole thing was theater from the jump. And then there are the bars. The bars are where the game stops pretending. On the song, he drops the line that has everybody losing their minds, the line that is going to be quoted in every comment section for the next 6 months. He raps, me, Drake and a Draco, we the 3 amigos, and then he follows it up with the knockout. He says, said pick a side, then I'm picking homicide. Read that again. Pick a side. Homicide. In the context of a Drake-Kendrick Lamar beef, in the context of a West Coast civil war, in the context of Drake being on the record, that line is not ambiguous. That is the game, in his own words, choosing violence, choosing Drake, and choosing to let the entire world know that if it comes down to Drake or Kendrick Lamar, he is not standing with the kid from the same city. And he does not stop there. The game goes all the way into Migos land with the wordplay, flipping Takeoff, Offset, and Quavo into the bars like he's showing off the whole flow. And then he caps it with champagne shooting like it's B-roll, which is just pure, unfiltered the game flexing on the beat like the last decade never happened. The man is hungry again. You can hear it in his voice. This is not a veteran coasting on legacy. This is somebody who has been waiting for his moment to be the center of attention again. and he found it by walking straight into the middle of the biggest beef in rap and lighting a match. Here's where it gets even more deliberate, though, and this is the part half the internet is still catching up on. The cover art. The Game, never one to do anything halfway, put the song out with artwork that nobody had to squint to understand. It's a broken-down classic car. No wheels. Sitting there stripped, wrecked, clearly taken out of commission. And if you've been paying any attention at all to the last 2 years of music, you know exactly what that car is supposed to be. It's a GNX. The GNX. The car that Kendrick Lamar built an entire album around. The car that became a symbol of his victory lap. The car that showed up everywhere as the sign that the West was his. And the Game put that car on his cover art with the wheels off, looking like it had been left on blocks. That is not subtlety. That is a billboard. That is the Game saying, in the clearest possible language, come outside. Let's play. Bring the car, bring the city, bring everything, because you already know where I stand. And before anybody tries to run with the, oh, he's just being artistic defense, let me shut that down right now. The Game paired that artwork with a song about picking homicide. He paired it with Drake on the hook. He paired it with a surprise album announcement that made sure the whole thing would trend at the exact moment people were reacting to the diss. That is not a coincidence. That is a rollout. That is a man running a play, and the play worked, because within hours, the entire TD side of the room was sitting up and saying something. Which brings us to the reactions, and baby, the reactions are where the comedy of this whole situation lives. TD, the camp that made Kendrick Lamar who he is, the camp that runs deep in the same streets the Game claims, jumped on the timeline almost immediately, and every single one of them had an opinion. Punch, who is literally the president of TD, kept it short but devastating. He wrote, "The world's really gone crazy." That's it. 5 words. No names. No explanation. But everybody knew exactly who he was talking about, and exactly what he meant. When the president of a label says the world has gone crazy in the middle of a controversy about one of your members' biggest rivals collabing with a hometown trader, it's not a weather report. It's a shot. Then you had Mackwop, who is tied into the whole TD world the way few people are, and Mackwop did not even pretend to be diplomatic. His reaction was basically 2 words of pure disgust. That's ass. Seriously, that's ass. No filter, no performance, no long think piece. Just a man watching a record drop and reacting the way half the city reacted, which is to say, this is embarrassing for somebody who used to carry this. And that right there is the split that this whole saga is really about, because there are 2 Comptons, 2 versions of the West, and they are not on the same page anymore. And that division is bigger than one song, because what is really happening right now is a whole region trying to figure out what it even is anymore. For the past 2 years, the West has been running on the high of Kendrick Lamar's victory. The Boogeyman era, the GNX era, the Not Like Us era, it handed the coast a confidence it had not felt since the days when Snoop and Dre were running the entire world. But underneath all that celebration, there was always a quieter question, and what the Game just did was drag it out into the open for everybody to see. Is the West actually unified, or was it just unified around one man's win while a whole room full of legends sat on the sidelines waiting for their own turn? The Game did not just challenge Kendrick Lamar. He challenged the entire idea that the coast had to move as one behind a single flag. And for a lot of the old heads who remember when the West was 100 different crews repping their own blocks first, that did not read as treason. It read as the truth they had all been too polite to say out loud. But then you had Hit Boy's World. You had Hita J3, who actually appears on Kendrick Lamar's GNX project. And Hita J3 went a completely different direction. He came out and said, "Hold on, relax. That song with the Game and Drake is not new. It's old. And the Game is not going to diss Kendrick Lamar, because that's a homie. That's still brother for brother. And you can't judge the whole relationship off one stunt." He was basically the one voice in the room trying to calm everybody down, trying to tell the timeline to stop turning a business move into a war. And look, I respect the attempt. I genuinely do. But Hita J3 is also the same man who gets it, who has watched this tension build for a decade. And even he had to admit that the optics are not great. Because here's the thing, and I need everybody to really hear this. Even if the song is old, even if Drake's ad-lib was sitting in a vault somewhere, even if the Game swears he wasn't shooting at anybody, choosing to release that record right now, with that artwork, with that hook, in the middle of everything, is not neutral. You don't drop a pick-a-side bar with Drake's voice while your city's biggest star is on the other side of that exact conflict and pretend you were just cleaning out the hard drive. And the Game heard all of it. Of course he did. The Game lives on the timeline. He responded the way he always responds when people start reading his lyrics back to him, which is to deny everything with a straight face while the evidence sits right there in front of everybody. He went into the comments and said, Ain't dis nobody on that song, loud for nothing, with a little ninja emoji for good measure, as if the broken GNX and the pick a sidebar and the Drake feature were all just a happy accident. And baby, that is the oldest trick in the book. It's the rapper's favorite escape hatch. Say enough to start the war, then deny you ever pulled the trigger when the smoke starts spreading. The game has built an entire career being able to look you dead in the eye and say, I wasn't talking about him, while the whole room knows he was absolutely talking about him. And if you needed any more proof that the denial was just cover, the very same album that surfaced the song is packed with references that are impossible to walk back. On the track, Jesus, the game literally raps about the situation out loud. He says, I say Drake the homie, y'all say it's treason. He names it. He knows exactly what the accusation is. That siding with Drake makes him a traitor to the West, a traitor to Kendrick Lamar, a traitor to everything Compton is supposed to stand for right now. And his answer is not apology. His answer is to lean all the way in. He doubles down on the pick sides language like he's daring somebody to come check him. There's even a bar on Jesus where he threatens to pop the steering column on the GNX and wait, which, again, is not a lyric you write if you're not sending for somebody, and everybody watching knows exactly who that somebody is. Then there's LA Monster, which might be the most blatant of them all. On that track, the game takes Kendrick Lamar's whole boogeyman persona, the exact title that became synonymous with the Not Like Us era, and flips it on its head. He raps that he ain't got no problem with the boogeyman, and the boogeyman ain't got no problem with him, because he is the LA Monster. He literally positions himself as the bigger predator, the creature that even the boogeyman has to respect. And then, just to make sure nobody misses it, he drops the line about the GNX scaring the hoes, a direct swipe at the very car and the very project that defined Kendrick Lamar's victory lap. You cannot write those bars by accident. You cannot stumble into them. That is a man with a pen and a point to prove, and the point is that the West is not as unified as the victory lap made it look. And then, on the pen, he does the thing that always drives the fans crazy, which is pretend to be confused by the whole conversation. He raps, they saying I'm beefing with Kendrick, how the heck do that sound? And follows it with a 50-cent comparison, as if that erases everything else on the album. But go listen to it. The song answers its own question within the same breath. Because you don't claim you're not beefing with somebody while simultaneously releasing a project that name-checks them, that mocks their car, that borrows their enemy's voice for a hook, and that leans on their entire rivalry for attention. That is not how no beef works. That is how a man who loves the spotlight keeps the spotlight pointed at him. Now, let me zoom out and talk about the bigger picture, because this is bigger than one song, and it's bigger than one artwork, and it's bigger than a couple of TD members subtweeting from the couch. But first I just want to say, before this album dropped, there were already signs. The game did a whole versus against YG over the summer, and they turned it into a moment, linking up on a record called Red People, and letting everybody know Compton was still in the building. And that memory matters more than people give it credit for, because the game and YG are two Compton legends who spent years circling each other before that night. And when they finally got into that versus, they gave the city a moment it is not going to forget anytime soon. They ran through the catalog. They traded the history. They let the building shake. And by the time the lights came down, they had turned a long-standing Cold War into a partnership and put their stamp on a unified West right when the coast needed it most. But unity that is built in one night is fragile, and everybody in that room knew it. Because the second the game started waving a Drake flag instead of a West flag, all that goodwill was going to get tested. And the test came faster than any of them expected. But the whole time, underneath the celebration, there was this undercurrent, this question of where the game really stood in the new West Coast order. He had already gone on record months earlier, in an interview, basically pleading with the world to appreciate Drake again, talking about how the clubs feel empty without Drake, how the whole culture dropped 50% when Drake stepped back, how the party doesn't hit the same when the biggest star on earth is sitting out. That was not a casual comment. That was the game drawing his line in the sand for anybody paying attention. He was telling you, in plain daylight, whose side he was on, months before he ever dropped No Breaks. So when the record finally hit, nobody who was actually watching should have been even a little bit surprised. And then came the album. The game, proving once again that he understands the algorithm better than half the marketing teams in the business, did not just drop the diss song and walk away. He used the diss song as the launchpad, rode all the outrage and all the controversy straight into his biggest announcement in years. He revealed that his new project, the documentary 3, the third chapter of the series that made him, would be arriving that same night. 24 songs, a feature list that reads like a who's who of the entire culture. Drake is on it. Ye is on it. Snoop Dogg, Lil Wayne, Tyga, Party Next Door, YG, Leon Thomas, Black Thought, Larry June, Drakeo the Ruler, Rest in Peace, Lefty Gunplay, AZ Chike, RJMRLA, and the production backbone of cats like Tommy Brown and Mike and Keys and Travis Wilson holding it all together. That is not a track list. That is a power move. That is the game standing in the middle of all these names and daring the conversation to stay on him. And that is the part the casual fans keep missing while they argue about whether the song is trash. They No Breaks thing, the GNX thing, the TDE thing. All of it was the trailer, but the real product has always been the album, and the game is far too seasoned not to know exactly how to sequence a rollout. 24 songs is not a, I needed to drop something real quick. 24 songs is a statement, a monument, a man staring at a 20-year legacy and saying I am not done yet, and neither is this city. When you put Snoop Dogg, Ye, Lil Wayne, Drake, and Black Thought on one project, you are not chasing a hit. You are assembling a coronation. The documentary 3 is not just the third chapter of a beloved series. It is the game claiming his spot at the center of a West Coast that had slowly started to write him out of the story, and he used the loudest controversy in all of music to make sure the entire world watched him do it in real time. And look, listen, I have got to be real with y'all about one thing, because I know the internet is going to do what it does. A lot of people heard No Breaks and immediately trashed it, said it was weak, said Drake phoning in 2 words was embarrassing, said the whole thing was just a desperate grab for relevance from a man who used to be the center of gravity. And I'm not going to sit here and say those people are crazy, because they're not. But I'm going to say they might be missing the point. This record was never really meant to be the song of the summer. It was never meant to be a classic. It was meant to be a match. It was meant to do exactly what it did, which is set the entire city on fire so that when the album dropped, everybody was already looking. And if you judge it by that standard, by the standard of, did it work? Did it get everybody talking? Did it force the room to react? Then it was a massive success. The game knew he didn't need a perfect song. He needed a perfect story. And a broken-down car with no wheels, sitting under a song called No Breaks, featuring the 2 most verboten syllables in the whole Drake-Kendrick Lamar war, was a perfect story. But here's the question that's actually hanging over all of this. The question that nobody seems able to answer yet. And it's the one that matters the most. What does Kendrick Lamar do now? And I want to be honest with you, because I think this is where the whole thing gets uncomfortable. Kendrick Lamar has spent 2 years operating at a level where he does not have to answer anything. He ignored the noise. He moved like a man who had already won the war and was just collecting his spoils. The boogeyman didn't have to explain himself to anybody. But now somebody from his own city, somebody who used to be an ally, somebody with all the history in the world, just walked up and knocked on the door with Drake's voice in his pocket. That changes the calculation. The game didn't just drop a record. The game changed the terms of the conversation, because now the conversation is no longer Kendrick Lamar against Drake. It's Kendrick Lamar against his own backyard. And that is a much messier fight. Because you have to understand what this does to the whole power map of the coast. For 2 years, Kendrick Lamar did not have to look over his shoulder. He had beaten Drake so thoroughly that the entire conversation simply moved on without the people who refused to accept it. He could wake up, go to the studio, drop a masterpiece, and let the world argue about it for a year while he stayed above it all like a man on the roof of a building watching the traffic down below. But a challenge from inside his own city is a different animal entirely. Drake could be dismissed as an outsider, the Toronto superstar who stepped into the wrong backyard and paid for it. The game cannot be dismissed that way. The game is from there. The game bled for the West when Kendrick Lamar was still in school. The game has receipts, relationships, and a claim to that same Compton legacy. And when a man like that knocks on the door with your biggest rival's voice in his pocket, you cannot just wave it off as irrelevant. It would be like the foundation of your own house starting an argument with you. You cannot ignore it the same way. And that is exactly why the game did it. He knew that no matter how high Kendrick Lamar climbed, he could never fully rise above a war that started in his own backyard. Here's my honest take, and I'll put it as plainly as I can. I don't think Kendrick Lamar drops a diss record. I don't think he needs to, and I don't think it's even in his interest to give this thing the oxygen. Kendrick Lamar is not in the game's weight class anymore, and deep down, everybody knows it. That's not disrespect to the game. The game is a legend, a Hall of Fame level rapper who has been great for 20 years. But the levels are different now. Kendrick Lamar is in that once-in-a-generation space where responding to every little provocation actually shrinks him, and I think he knows that. I think he'll do what he's been doing, which is let the work speak, let the silence sit, and let the streets decide whether this was a war cry or just a very loud commercial. But that doesn't mean there won't be shots. There will absolutely be shots. There already are shots. The entire TD roster has made peace with the fact that they're in a Cold War now, and the temperature is rising. Punch's 5 words were the first flare. Mackwop's 2 words were the second. And if you think the rest of the camp is going to just sit there and let the game walk away with the narrative, you have not been paying attention to how TD handles business. This is a crew that moves quietly, strategically, and then strikes all at once. They are not going to let the West Coast be redefined by a man who keeps telling everybody he's not even picking sides while his lyrics say the exact opposite. And that, right there, is the real tragedy underneath the drama, and I don't want to gloss over it. This is 2 men from the same city. 2 men who came up in the same streets, who faced down the same darkness, who both climbed out of Compton and turned it into the most important place in music. There was a version of this story where they were brothers, where they stood shoulder to shoulder for the West, where the city that made them both became an unbreakable fortress. And instead, we're watching it fracture in real time, over a feud that started with somebody else, over a war that neither of them even needed. Drake didn't make the game choose. Kendrick Lamar didn't force the issue. The game chose, on his own, to walk into the middle of a battle that belonged to other people and plant a flag. And now the whole city has to live with the fallout. So here's my problem with the way the game has played this, and I'll be fair even though it might sound harsh. For years, the knock on the game has been the same, that when it comes time to actually stand somewhere, he always manages to be standing in 2 places at once. He calls everybody brother. He keeps a foot in every camp. He wants to be the guy who never burns a bridge, never makes an enemy permanent, never has to live with a clean choice. But No Breaks was different, because this time he finally picked. He picked Drake. He said it out loud. And maybe that's growth, and maybe that's honesty, and maybe there's even something admirable about a man finally telling the world where his loyalty lies. But you can't then turn around the next morning and say you weren't dissing anybody. That's not duality. That's just wanting the chaos without wanting the consequences. You want the heat of the fire, but not the smoke. And the streets can smell that from a mile away. Because here is what the "it is just business" crowd keeps refusing to acknowledge. For these streets, loyalty was never a marketing tool. It was the entire point. This is a city where the wrong look can end a whole career and the right one can make you immortal, where people still argue about who held who down during what era like it all happened yesterday. The game spent years telling anybody who would listen that he was a man of the people, the bridge between every faction, the one guy who could break bread with everybody and never once have to choose. But the Drake move was a choice, and the city read it as a choice. And once that bell has been rung, you cannot unring it by dropping a ninja emoji under somebody's repost. Whatever happens next, the relationship between the game and the Kendrick Lamar camp is never going back to whatever it was before No Breaks. It has been permanently changed, and I think deep down, everybody involved already knows it. The only real question now is how loud the rest of it gets, and how many other people get pulled into the crossfire before somebody finally decides to turn the temperature down. I'll leave you with this, because I know there are going to be a million arguments in the comments about who's right and who's wrong, and whether the song is actually fire or actually trash. But step back from the song itself and look at the whole board. The game dropped a record featuring the most polarizing voice in music, hung a wrecked GNX on the front of it, name-checked the Boogeyman on the same album, denied all of it with a straight face, and then announced a 24-track project stacked with every big name he could reach. That is not somebody losing the plot. That is somebody who understands attention warfare better than almost anybody alive, and who has decided that in the biggest feud of the modern era, he is done standing on the sidelines. He wants in. He wants the whole city watching. And whether the city loves him for it or turns on him for it, that's exactly what he's getting. Before you go argue it out, let me give you the one prediction I feel most strongly about, because I have been wrong before and I will own it if I am wrong again. But this feels different. I do not think this ends with one song. I think this ends with a slow, drawn-out, season-long Cold War where every new drop, every new interview, every new Instagram story becomes a data point in a battle neither side actually wants to start, but neither side is willing to let go of, either. I think the game keeps poking. I think TD keeps responding in code. I think Kendrick Lamar keeps mostly quiet and lets the work do the talking. And I think at some point, probably when nobody expects it, one of them says the thing that cannot be unsaid, and the entire coast has to pick a real side whether it wants to or not. My honest guess, the game is too competitive and too aware of his own legacy to ever let this thing fully die. He wants the tension. He feeds on it. And that is precisely why the rest of us are going to be glued to this thing for months. So now the only question left, and I genuinely need you to answer this in the comments because I want to know where your head is at. The game finally, officially, chose Drake. Not with a whisper, not with a maybe, but with a song, an album, a car with no wheels, and a bar about homicide. So tell me, is this the game finally being honest for the first time in his career, finally throwing on the jersey and standing in the fire with the man he's called his brother for a decade? Or is this the exact same old the game, hedging, baiting, rolling out a diss that's mostly a marketing stunt, and leaving himself just enough room to run it back with a smile when somebody finally asks him to choose for real? Because make no mistake, baby, somebody is about to ask him. The West is watching. The whole culture is watching. And this time, there's no ninja emoji in the world big enough to hide behind.